Equity Mates, from our mates at Spaceship. Investing made easy.
Welcome back to another episode of Equity Mates. It is our favourite episode of the week. It is Watchlist Wednesday. My name is Bryce, and as always, I'm joined by my equity buddy, Ren. How are you going?
I'm very good, Bryce. Love a Watchlist Wednesday, and love that we've got Roger Montgomery back for another episode to hear 3 stocks on his watch list.
Yes, Roger, welcome.
Good to be with you again.
So we've covered a lot over the last 2 days, but we can't go past the opportunity to hear 3 stocks that are on Roger's watch list or in his portfolio. So let's start at the top, Roger. We're going a bit broad. We're going the banks.
Yeah, so we bought CBA and Westpac. We started buying them with some enthusiasm during the COVID lockdown, during that big sell-off in March last year. So I should just caveat what I say that we've paid lower prices than current prices for the banks. If we take a step back and think about what banks do, they borrow money at lower rates than they lend money, right? And they try and maximise their net interest margin. Banks have been on the nose for a very long time because that net interest margin has been under pressure. So that's when you're looking at an industrial business, that's their gross profit, right? Their net interest margin is the gross profit, if you like, and then they've got all the other revenues and then other expenses. So when do banks make the most money? Well, if you remember this framework, if you remember these 3 things, you'll always know when to own the banks and when not to own the banks. The 3 things are, they make money when interest rates are really high, they make money when the yield curve is really steep, and they make money when credit spreads are really wide. Now, last year, we had the opposite. We had flat yield curve, we had really low interest rates, and credit spreads were super narrow. But here's the thing, it couldn't get any worse, right? You couldn't get flatter than flat, you couldn't get lower than 0, and you're probably not going to get credit spreads any narrower. So our basic thought, our overarching thought, and we know the banks in great detail, but our overarching thought was, this is as bad as it gets for the economy and the banks, and from here, it potentially gets better. Either the yield curve starts to steepen, credit growth starts to accelerate, and that's what happened with JobKeeper and other stimulatory measures that the government put in place. And we weren't worried about a property market collapse. I wrote an article for The Australian that basically said, look, property might fall 5%, between 5 and 10%, that would be it. And what you've got to remember, if I can just digress momentarily on property, because I know in our episode, a couple of episodes ago, I said property will never fall 30%.
Yeah. Glad we got that on record.
Hey, you're welcome to use it, trot it out. Roger did say this, but it still hasn't happened.
Yeah.
You think about where the incentives are, and then that's where the behaviour is. That's where you find the behaviour. Who incentivises people to buy houses in Australia? The government incentivises people to buy houses, right? Either through first home buyers grants, renovation grants, building grants, whatever, the building incentive, whatever it is, governments over years, and then all of the tax incentives. So you've got capital gains tax deductions, no capital gains tax if you own the house, if it's your own home, primary place of residence rather. So there's so many incentives that the government has put in place to encourage people to buy property. If property fell 30%, it would be on the government's head.
Yeah.
And they don't want that. So they're incentivised not to allow property to fall. And that's why when people complain about affordability, the government doesn't say we need to bring property prices down. They say, let's give people more money to pay higher prices, right? Because they're incentivised to keep the property market elevated. You've got to remember the other thing is, it's the biggest single asset on consumers' balance sheets. They've got more money invested in property than in anything else. So you'd get a massive backlash, a massive voter backlash. Then if you think about it, APRA doesn't want property prices to fall, neither does the RBA, because we want our banks unquestionably strong. And you might remember in the last episode we talked about bubbles, and we said bubbles can foment and collapse And as long as those assets aren't held on the balance sheets of banks or systemically important financial institutions, it doesn't matter. But property in Australia is. It is held. Mortgages on property are held by the banks and in size. And so it really is important that we don't see property prices fall. And then, of course, last year, we had the best litmus test we could have possibly had to see whether or not property prices would collapse. And you had a few people out there, you had even some bank economists saying property could fall by a third. And what did the banks do? Did the banks hoover up all the people that lost their jobs and couldn't pay their mortgages anymore? Did the banks hoover up their properties and put them out for mortgagee in possession sales? They told everyone, you don't have to pay.
Yeah.
You know, and you've got JobKeeper, go buy yourself something nice. You go for a holiday, you still don't have to pay. We'll give you a holiday on your mortgage. So there was the best test we had when it comes to the crunch. Will banks dump property on the market if you can't pay your mortgage? And the answer to that is no. They're not incentivised to do it. In fact, they're disincentivised to do it. So when we bring that back to the story for the banks is that it couldn't get any worse for them. Credit growth is going to emerge, property prices are going to recover, and people are going to take advantage of the term funding facility that was offered to the banks to allow the banks to offer really low rates on 3-year and 4-year mortgages, fixed, and that's what they've done. So now something like 40% of mortgages are fixed, whereas normally it's only about 5% that are fixed. And that told me that we're going to get credit growth out of the economy recovering, out of property prices recovering, and there'd be less pressure on the NIM or the net interest margin. So the story for the banks is pretty good.
Yeah, wow.
So that's banks generally. We've
Yes.
got to ask, if you look at the banks in Australia, do you have a favourite at the moment?
Look, at the moment, it would be a toss-up between the CBA and Westpac, and I confess that we own both of those, and they're quite large positions in our portfolios, and they have been now for a year or thereabouts. In fact, we've got the biggest position in the banks in our all-cap funds that we've ever had. We'll never be 27%, which is the index weighting to the banks, but we're about 15% weighted to the banks at the moment. So it'd be out of those two, and if I was to say today, which one would be, probably Westpac, because it's still probably a little bit mispriced because it's on the nose reputationally. Yeah.
So Roger, the second stock on your watch list is Telstra.
Yes. Similar story to the banks. You know, it's not as cheap as it was, but in that environment of inflation emerging, so where inflation emerges and scares the market at the growthy end, Telstra will perform very, very well. So will the banks, by the way. So in that environment that I suspect might happen, and I don't know that it will, I don't have a crystal ball, but in an environment where the market does start to get scared of inflation, albeit temporarily, having your money in the banks and in Telstra, and that's why we've got some money in the banks and Telstra, will provide, I don't want to use the word ballast, but it'll provide some downside protection. We won't capture as much of the downside with those stocks. We'll fall less with those stocks in the portfolio.
Yeah.
Telstra's one of those. So Telstra's an interesting story, and it's a bit like the banks in the sense that the worst is over. So you had a situation where the market was really, really scared that the NBN payments to Telstra, a couple of $1 billion or $3 billion, for migrating customers from the copper network over to the NBN was going to leave a huge gaping hole in their revenue of that amount. What the market underestimated was just how successful Andy Penn would be at plugging that hole with cost-cutting measures. And he's done that very, very successfully. And so that's less of an issue for the market now. And it's why the stock's been re-rated. The market was also worried, of course, about dividends being cut, which they were, but we expected that. And the market was also pretty upset or not happy with the irrational pricing for mobile phone plans. But what's actually happened is that the consolidation of the industry, of the telecommunications industry, and the final element of that consolidation was really Vodafone merging with TPG. That meant that we returned to rational pricing for mobile phone plans. So that was gone as well. So once all the bad stuff had been dealt with, the market can start to look forward and say, well, actually this 5G story is a pretty interesting story. You know, the Internet of Everything, that story hasn't gone away, and 5G will facilitate that. And if you've got devices, more devices you want to connect to the Internet, and you want them to be connected to fast 5G, well, guess what? There's really only Telstra to deal with. And it's still some years away before 5G penetrates Australia-wide, but it's ahead of everybody else. So that quality network will mean it can command premium pricing. And we know from studying telecommunications companies all around the world, the companies that have the most customers can invest the most money in their network. It becomes a virtuous circle. And they command the highest price because they've got the best network. And that's Telstra. And we also think that its process that it's undergoing to split off the towers, for example, to recognise the value of those assets, because there's a lot of talk globally about generating more income, then that's again going to reward investors in Telstra.
So, Roger, we could talk Telstra and the banks all day, but
Yes.
we want to talk about one that we perhaps don't know as much about. We definitely don't hear about as much in the news, and that's IDP Education.
Sure.
So, for those unfamiliar with the stock, can you tell us a little bit about what it does and then why you like it?
So IDP Education is a business that it's the only commercial stakeholder in the programs that are designed to bring overseas students to universities in Western countries. And it's also the only, or it's the biggest commercial provider of international English language testing. So if you want to become a resident of a foreign country, if you want to work in a foreign country, in an English-speaking country, you have to do an English language test, and you have to pay for that, and IDP runs that program. And so it's really suffered in COVID-related lockdown. There's no doubt that we aren't getting foreign students into Australia at the moment, but that's not necessarily true overseas to the same extent, although it has been pulled back. So it's been a COVID loser.
Yeah.
Now, we've previously owned IDP and done very, very well out of this business. It's a high-quality business from the perspective of having relatively little debt or no debt, and also high rates of return on equity. So we like it from that perspective. We've bought it recently because it was attractively priced, because we're in lockdown, and every time there are delays to vaccinations, every time borders don't seem to be opening until further out in the horizon, stocks like IDP, those that are leveraged to a reopening, are hit. And IDP is a business that is going to pop very, very quickly as a result of borders reopening. And I have a personal view, and it's only, I have no evidence for this, but I have a personal view that our universities and our tourism sector stand to benefit the most from a reopening, because they're suffering the most from being closed. I climbed the Harbour Bridge on the weekend. It was my daughter's birthday, and as a present, the family climbed the Harbour Bridge. And the guy running that operation, or our guide for that climb, he was telling us that in the days when pre-COVID, they were doing something like 2,000 climbs a day,
Wow.
7 days a week. Now it's all Australians doing the climb, and I think they're only open 3 days a week.
Wow.
And they're not doing 2,000 a day. So it really, tourism businesses have been hit very, very hard. But I digress. IDP Education is a business that is leveraged to a reopening.
Yep.
And the universities are suffering a lot. They can't afford to continue suffering. So that is a big reason, or a big incentive for governments to reopen.
Yeah.
You go.
Okay. It's a fascinating story, and it's one, education is a $40 billion export industry, I think I read recently. Like, it's a huge industry.
Yes, it is.
There's a lot of incentive to get that export singing again.
Yes.
But there is a question about timing, and
Correct.
vaccination rollout has been slower than expected. I think there's talk that international flights may not be resuming until 2022 now.
Well, that's what Scott Morrison said.
Yeah.
That's right.
So how do you think about timing for a stock like this?
So you've got business lobbying the government really hard to open up, and you saw the Virgin CEO say she doesn't care if people die.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, she did
right?
say not great from her.
No, it
PR
didn't
people
look
would be
good.
happy,
Hey, people are going to die, but let's open up.
Yeah.
Hey, let's get our health advice from business people. Please. Hopefully, Scott Morrison listens to the health advice and not to business people, and that's really important. Having said that, though, you've got to size your position appropriately for that risk. if you wait until you're certain borders are going to open again, then you've missed the boat,
Too late,
or you've
yeah.
missed the early part of the rally anyway, and arguably the steepest part of the gains that could be made. So I think we know the negative story. I think we know that it's bad, and we know that, what's interesting is the company's making money despite the fact that we're in COVID lockdown. It's still profitable, even though, and its core business is still profitable, even though we've been in lockdown, which is quite surprising. Even for us, it was surprising.
Yeah.
So we don't know when we'll be back to normal. I don't know if we'll ever be back to normal. But I do know that it won't be worse than what we're seeing now. And the government IDP has plenty of money to survive this period. And it's not burning cash like some other businesses that are leveraged to a recovery. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of good points there. People should go back and rewatch this episode. Position sizing, looking at their balance sheet, thinking probabilistically about, can it get worse, and then what's the I guess the opportunities for it to improve. So
we are. Can I just say we are very disciplined about position sizing. So it might be a 2.5% position in our portfolio. And that's really important. I know when people are managing when investors are managing their own portfolios, they're probably less disciplined about position sizing, but it is everything.
Yeah.
It really does matter.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can pick that conversation up in our final episode tomorrow, but thank you, Roger, for sharing your
pleasure.
3 stocks. We've covered inflation, we've covered value versus growth, we've covered crypto. Plenty going on this week, but we will close it out with Roger tomorrow to hear what trends he has his eyes on, and also what stock he would hold for the next 30 years. It's going to be a cracker.
Can't wait.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Equity Mates, from our mates at Spaceship. Investing made easy.